While American media celebrated the capture of a dictator, the real story was unfolding 9,000 miles away in the halls of the Forbidden City. January 3, 2026, became the single most expensive day in the history of Chinese foreign policy. In less than 24 hours, China watched $100 billion vanish into thin air. This wasn't just about Nicolás Maduro's arrest. This was about the largest geopolitical eviction in modern history, and the terrifying reason why millions of Chinese citizens are now asking themselves one question. If America can do this in Venezuela, what stops them from doing the same in Taiwan? Today, we're going deep into the story the mainstream media isn't telling you. We're investigating how the United States just executed the biggest asset seizure of the 21st century, why Beijing is issuing unprecedented ultimatums to Washington, and what this means for the new map of global power. This is the $100 billion eviction, and by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the world you wake up to tomorrow will never be the same. The breaking news from Beijing isn't just diplomatic protest, it's pure panic. Within hours of Maduro's capture, the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued 4 explicit demands to the Trump administration, a level of directness rarely seen in Chinese diplomacy. They're demanding Maduro's immediate release, a complete halt to what they're calling the illegal Donro Doctrine, and compensation for seized Chinese assets. But here's what they're not saying publicly. Venezuela represents China's single largest bad debt on the planet, and it just became worthless overnight. Let me paint you the picture of what China actually lost. Over the past 2 decades, Beijing poured an estimated $100 billion into Venezuela through what they called oil for loan deals. This was supposed to be genius strategy. China provided the cash, Venezuela paid it back in millions of barrels of discounted heavy crude, and Beijing secured a strategic foothold in America's backyard. It was the crown jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Western Hemisphere. But on January 3rd, that entire strategy collapsed like a house of cards. As of this morning, Venezuela still owes China $15.6 billion in direct, unpaid loans. But here's where it gets devastating for Beijing. Under the new US-backed provisional government, those debts are being treated as what international law calls odious debt. This is money borrowed by a dictator for his own benefit, money that the people of Venezuela are not legally required to pay back. If Washington successfully applies this label, and they will, China's $15 billion becomes zero. Not restructured, not renegotiated, zero. But wait, it gets worse. China doesn't just hold paper debt in Venezuela. They own physical infrastructure, massive oil upgrader facilities, transport hubs, and joint venture stakes in the state oil company PDVSA. With U.S. oil majors like Chevron now taking operational control under the provisional government, China has been effectively evicted from the very facilities they spent billions building. Imagine spending 20 years building a house, only to have someone change the locks while you're at work. That's what just happened to China in Venezuela. And the Communist Party leadership knows they have no legal recourse, no military option, and no leverage to get it back. To understand why Beijing is in full crisis mode, we need to talk about oil. China is the world's largest oil importer, consuming roughly 14 million barrels per day to keep its industrial machine running. Venezuela wasn't just another supplier, it was China's shadow supplier, operating outside the traditional Western-controlled oil markets. In December 2025, Venezuela was shipping over 600,000 barrels per day to Chinese refineries. That's 4% of China's total imports, and more importantly, it was being sold at massive discounts, bypassing U.S. sanctions through a ghost fleet of dark tankers that turned off their transponders and operated in the shadows. This cheap Venezuelan heavy crude was the lifeblood of China's independent teapot refineries, hundreds of small and medium-sized facilities in Shandong province that operate outside the control of China's state oil giants. Without this discounted supply, many of these refineries face bankruptcy. But here's the real knife twist from Washington. President Trump didn't just cut off China's oil supply. He's now positioning the United States as the gatekeeper of that supply. His message to Beijing was crystal clear. China will get Venezuelan oil, but we will be the ones selling it to them at our prices, under our terms. Think about what this means. For 2 decades, China has been building what they call energy security, diversifying away from Middle Eastern suppliers controlled by American military presence, creating direct relationships with producers like Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. In one military operation, the United States just demolished that entire strategy for the Western Hemisphere. China is no longer a strategic partner getting friendly discounts. They're now a customer standing in line, checkbook in hand, waiting for American permission to buy oil from a country where they invested $100 billion. This isn't just an economic blow. This is an energy siege that puts the United States in partial control of China's industrial output. Now let's talk about how this actually happened, because the military execution tells you everything you need to know about America's new doctrine. Operation Absolute Resolve wasn't a prolonged invasion. It was a surgical strike that combined cyber warfare, special operations, and overwhelming air superiority. Hours before boots hit the ground, U.S. Cyber Command neutralized Venezuela's military communication networks. Command and control simply went dark. When Venezuelan generals tried to coordinate a response, they were shouting into dead phones. The capture of Maduro himself occurred just hours after he had finished a meeting with China's special envoy. The timing was no accident. This was a deliberate message to Beijing. Your money cannot protect your allies from American power. Your diplomatic cover means nothing. Your $100 billion investment bought you exactly 0 influence when we decided to move. And here's the most important detail that's being overlooked. Throughout this entire operation, China had no ability to respond, no military bases in the region to launch from, no naval presence to threaten, no leverage to apply. They could only watch, protest, and calculate their losses. This is the Monroe Doctrine in action, the Trump administration's rebranding of the Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century. It treats the entire Western Hemisphere as an exclusive American sphere of influence where competing great powers are simply not tolerated. We haven't seen anything like this since the Panama invasion of 1989, but that was before China became a global power. This time, the message isn't just to a regional dictator, it's to Beijing, and it's being heard loud and clear in Moscow, Tehran, and every other capital that thought American dominance was in decline. Here's where this story takes a truly dangerous turn. The most revealing reaction to the Venezuela crisis isn't coming from government statements or diplomatic cables, it's coming from the Chinese people themselves. On Weibo, China's equivalent of Twitter, the hashtag related to Maduro's capture exploded to 440 million views in a single weekend. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 1/3 of China's entire internet-using population engaging with this story, and the comments are absolutely chilling. They're filled with variations of the same terrified realization. If the United States can simply seize a head of state in Caracas, deploy overwhelming military force in a country where China invested $100 billion and face 0 meaningful consequences, what stops them from doing exactly the same thing in the Taiwan Strait? For years, the Chinese Communist Party has told its citizens that American power is overstretched, declining, and unable to project force the way it once could. Venezuela just shattered that narrative in the most public way possible. This has triggered a radical recalculation in Beijing's strategic planning. Chinese military analysts are now openly discussing what they call the Venezuela precedent. If the United States is willing to risk a complete diplomatic rupture with China over Venezuelan oil fields, they're certainly willing to risk far more over Taiwan's semiconductor facilities, which are exponentially more valuable to American economic security. We're seeing an alignment of concern stretching from Moscow to Tehran. These nations are suddenly realizing that the United States is no longer playing by the old rules-based international order. They are playing by the rules of resource realism. If we need it and you can't defend it, it's ours. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. China's entire foreign policy for the past 2 decades has been built on a theory called peaceful rise. The idea that they could become a global superpower through economic integration without direct military confrontation with the United States. Venezuela just proved that theory catastrophically wrong. You can invest all the money in the world, but if you can't park an aircraft carrier group nearby, you don't actually own anything. You're just renting, and the lease can be terminated at any moment. So where does this leave us? As Nicolás Maduro sits in a New York detention facility awaiting trial, the aftershocks of his capture are rippling across the global financial system. China is currently reporting its exposure to the Venezuelan default to its central banking system, bracing for what some analysts are calling a potential financial earthquake in their overseas lending portfolio. Meanwhile, U.S. oil companies are already moving equipment into Venezuela, preparing to rebuild the Orinoco oil infrastructure with the promise of flooding global markets with heavy crude that could drive prices to historic lows. The $100 billion is gone. The strategic gateway to Latin America is slammed shut. And for the first time in 30 years, the American backyard is completely empty of great power rivals. But let's be clear about something. This victory comes with enormous risk. China is now cornered, and a cornered dragon is a dangerous creature. Beijing is facing a choice between accepting this humiliation and setting a precedent that invites more American intervention in their overseas investments, or responding with economic retaliation that could spiral into something far worse. We're already seeing the early moves. China has quietly suspended new loans to several Belt and Road countries, conducting what insiders call a global audit, of which investments might be vulnerable to similar American action. There's serious discussion in Beijing about accelerating their timeline for Taiwan, operating under the logic that if they're going to lose everything anyway, they might as well move while they still have the element of surprise. This is the most dangerous kind of strategic thinking, the kind that starts wars nobody actually wants. The fundamental question facing the world right now is this: are we witnessing the start of a total resource war between the United States and China? Or is this a new, more aggressive form of peace where America simply dominates through the credible threat of overwhelming force? History suggests we're entering a period of extreme instability. When one great power humiliates another this completely, the humiliated power doesn't just accept it. They look for opportunities to restore their credibility, to prove they're not as weak as they just appeared. For the average person watching this, here's what you need to understand. The post-Cold War era is definitively over. The rules that governed international relations for the past 3 decades, the belief that economic interdependence would prevent great power conflict, the faith in international institutions to manage disputes, all of that just died in Caracas. We're entering a new age of resource nationalism, where the countries with the military power to seize and hold strategic assets will do exactly that, and everyone else will be forced to adapt or perish. China just learned the most expensive lesson in modern history. You cannot buy security, you cannot purchase sovereignty, and you certainly cannot build a global empire with loans and infrastructure projects if you lack the aircraft carriers to defend them. The $100 billion eviction is complete, and the new map of power is being drawn in real time. The only question that matters now is, who's next? And that question is keeping leaders awake at night from Havana to Harare, because Venezuela wasn't unique, it was a template. Right now, there are at least 17 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that owe China more than they can ever realistically pay back. These nations took Beijing's money, built Chinese-designed infrastructure, and assumed that Beijing's economic power would protect them from Western interference. Venezuela just proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Every president, Every prime minister, every dictator who signed a Belt and Road deal is now doing the same math. If America decides they want what's mine, can China actually stop them? Let's look at the specific vulnerabilities. In Africa, China has poured over $60 billion into countries like Zambia, Kenya, and Djibouti. They built ports, railways, and mining operations under the same model they used in Venezuela, loans that get repaid in natural resources and strategic access. But here's the nightmare scenario Beijing is now planning for. What happens if a pro-Western government takes power in Zambia and declares those copper mining contracts invalid? What happens if Kenya, facing its own debt crisis, decides to nationalize the Chinese-built railway and refuses to pay? China would face the exact same choice they're facing right now in Venezuela: accept the loss or start a war they can't win. And here's where it connects back to Taiwan in the most dangerous way possible. Chinese military strategists are now arguing internally that the Venezuela operation has actually created a window of opportunity. Their logic goes like this: if America is willing to humiliate China this badly over Venezuela, a country that's not even a formal ally, then conflict over Taiwan is inevitable anyway. The United States has already demonstrated they will not respect Chinese interests when American interests are at stake. So the question isn't whether there will be a confrontation over Taiwan. The question is when and under what circumstances China has the best chance of winning. This is the kind of fatalistic strategic thinking that makes wars inevitable. When one side concludes that conflict is unavoidable, they stop trying to prevent it and start trying to optimize the timing. We saw this exact pattern in 1914 when European powers convinced themselves that war was coming eventually, so they might as well fight it while they had advantages. The result was World War I. The parallel is uncomfortably precise. Meanwhile, back in Washington, there's a very different calculation happening. The Trump administration is looking at Venezuela and seeing proof of concept. They just seized $100 billion worth of Chinese assets, captured a hostile head of state, and secured American control over one of the world's largest oil reserves. And what was the cost? Some angry statements from Beijing, a few diplomatic protests, and absolutely zero meaningful retaliation. From the American perspective, this was a cost-free victory, and that creates a powerful incentive to do it again. Senior officials in the administration are already identifying the next targets. Cuba is the obvious one, sitting just 90 miles from Florida with significant Chinese investment in telecommunications and port infrastructure. Nicaragua is another possibility, where China has been planning a transoceanic canal that would compete with Panama. Then there's Ecuador, Bolivia, and even Argentina, all countries with left-leaning governments and substantial Chinese economic ties. The temptation to replicate the Venezuela model is enormous, especially when oil prices are high and American voters are demanding cheaper gasoline. But here's the critical risk that nobody in Washington seems to be calculating properly. China doesn't have to win a military confrontation to hurt the United States. They just have to make the cost unbearable. If China decides to retaliate for Venezuela by, say, dumping their $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, the resulting spike in interest rates would crash the American economy.